Frost had come early to Rivenhall that year, and it had settled first upon the stable roof, so that before the house itself woke, the long slate ridge above the horse-yard glittered white, while the chimneys of the servants' wing still slept dark and cold. The gravel of the yard was rimed and silent. A single lantern burned in the tack-room window, its flame small and steady behind old glass, and beyond the wall the black shape of the north paddock fence ran off into mist. Somewhere inside the stable a horse struck the boards of his stall. Once, twice. A sound like a fist against a door that had been shut too long. No one went into him before full light. That had been the rule for 4 years, since the morning young Master Edmund Ashworth had been carried up from the west field with his neck broken and his boot still caught in the stirrup, and his elder brother had walked behind the litter without a word. His face the colour of the frost on the roof. The horse that had thrown him, a black colt scarcely broken, wild-eyed even then, had been kept ever since. Not sold, not destroyed, not tamed. He had a name once. Now the grooms called him only the Duke's curse, and said it quietly, because the Duke did not like to hear it, and because 3 men had since gone into that stall with rope and courage, and had come out with broken ribs, a shattered wrist, and, in one case, a limp that never fully mended. It was into this cold, waiting silence that Wren Hartley walked on her first morning at Rivenhall Park. A canvas bag over one shoulder and her chin lifted against the wind, because lifting one's chin cost nothing, and sometimes it was the only thing a person had left to spend. She was 22, though the housekeeper who met her at the servants' door guessed younger, on account of the thinness of her wrists and the careful, economical way she moved, like someone who had learned that unnecessary motion wasted warmth. Her gown had been a good blue once. It was grey-blue now, the hem let down twice, and hemmed a 3rd time in a thread that did not quite match, and one glove had been mended at the same seam so many times that the seam itself had become a kind of decoration. She did not explain any of this. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father's death, that explaining poverty only made other people uncomfortable, and did nothing at all to warm her hands. She had been hired as an under-housemaid, 3rd rank, to sweep grates and carry water and make herself small in doorways when better people passed. She was not hired to go near the stables. No one had told her this in so many words, because no one had imagined it needed saying. And yet, on her 2nd morning, crossing the kitchen garden with a basket of clean linen balanced against her hip, she heard, over the wall, a sound she recognized in her bones before she recognized it in her mind. The particular terrible silence that comes after a scream, when a man has been thrown and has not yet found the breath to make a second sound. She did not decide to go. Her feet simply went, the basket abandoned on the frozen cabbage bed, her skirts caught up in one fist, and she came through the stable gate to find a groom named Silas flat on his back in the straw. One arm bent beneath him at a wrong angle, and above him, filling the open half-door of the end stall like something poured from black glass. The horse. He was beautiful in the way that a struck match is beautiful, in the half-second before it burns the fingers. 17 hands if he was an inch, his coat the deep unbroken black of a winter pond, his neck arched and his ears flat back, and his eyes showing white at the rim. 2 other grooms stood well back, one with a pitchfork held out before him like a man warding off a ghost, and neither of them moved to help Silas, because to move was to draw the horse's attention, and the horse's attention, in that yard, was a thing men had learned to fear. Wren did not think about fear. She thought about her father's hands, broad, split-knuckled, endlessly patient hands that she had watched for 16 years gentle every terrified, half-wild creature brought to him. And she thought, without deciding to think it, of the low, wordless sound he used to make in his chest, more breath than voice, that had no name she had ever learned to spell. She made that sound now. The stallion's ears came up. Not soft, not yet, but they came up, and turned the way a man's head turns at a voice he half remembers from a dream. She did not go toward Silas. She went, instead, 3 slow steps toward the horse, her palm turned up and empty, her eyes not on his eyes, but on his shoulder, and she kept making the sound, low, continuous, a thread pulled taut between them, until the horse's forefeet came down off half rear and planted, trembling, on the cobbles, and his great head dropped, by degrees, until his nose was almost within reach of her outstretched hand. There, she said, so quietly that only he could have heard it. There now. I know. It was in that suspended moment, the horse still shaking, the groom groaning back to consciousness in the straw, 2 stable hands standing with their mouths open, that the Duke of Rivenhall came round the corner of the coach-house at a dead run, greatcoat unbuttoned, hatless, having heard the scream from the terrace, where he had been standing with his steward over a ledger he did not yet know was lying to him. He stopped as if he had struck a wall. He had seen in 4 years grown men weep rather than enter that stall. He had seen his own hands shake reaching for that halter, on the 2 occasions he had tried it himself, telling no one, in the grey hour before dawn, because some private and unforgivable part of him believed that if he could master the horse that had killed his brother, he might finally be permitted to stop grieving. He had never once gotten close enough to touch the animal's neck. He watched a servant girl he did not recognize lay her bare palm flat against Corvus's cheek, and watched the horse, his brother's murderer, 4 years unridden, unbroken, unforgiven, lean very slightly into her hand the way a man leans into a fire on a cold night, without deciding to, simply because the body remembers warmth. Nobody spoke. The frost went on glittering on the roof. And the Duke of Rivenhall, 30 years old and unused to being astonished by anything, stood in the cold with his coat hanging open, and found that he could not, for the length of several long breaths, remember how to begin. He sent Silas, once the groom had been carried off with his arm splintered and cursing cheerfully at his own bad luck, to fetch the housekeeper, and gave strict, quiet instruction that the new girl was not to be turned off for having trespassed where she had no leave to go. He did not, that first morning, thank her himself. He only stood a moment longer at the stall door after the yard had emptied, watching the black horse lower his head to drink from the trough for the first time in longer than any groom could remember, and felt something in his chest move that he had spent 4 years training himself not to feel at all. His name, she learned before the week was out, was Julian Ashworth, 6th Duke of Rivenhall, and he was not at all what the other maid's whispers had prepared her for. She had expected, from the hush that fell whenever his name was spoken, from the black draped portrait of the younger brother that still hung, uncleaned, in the long gallery, a man made entirely of ice and correctness. What she found, on the several occasions their paths crossed in that first fortnight, was a man who moved through his own house like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, who ate alone, who kept the stable ledgers himself rather than trust them fully to his steward, and who came, twice, to stand at the paddock rail in the blue hour before dawn and watch her, at a distance, doing nothing more remarkable than brushing burrs from the stallion's mane, while she hummed some tuneless thing under her breath. He did not speak to her the first time. The second time, he did. "You are not afraid of him," he said. It was not quite a question. Wren did not startle, though she had not heard him approach. 4 years below stairs teaches a person to hear footsteps before they arrive. She kept her hand moving through the coarse black hair, slow, unhurried. "I was taught not to be afraid of the wrong things, Your Grace. Fear is only useful when it points at something true." And what is true about him? She considered this with the same care she gave every task, turning it over before answering, because words, like coal, were not to be wasted. "That he has been alone a long time," she said at last, "and that everyone who has come near him since has come near him with a rope." The Duke said nothing for a long moment. His jaw worked once, almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign that something in the observation had found its mark and lodged there. "And you did not come with a rope." "I came with my hand empty, Your Grace. It is the only thing my father ever taught me. That never once failed. Your father was a horseman." "My father," she said, and here, for the first time, something in her voice tightened, though her face did not change, was the finest breeder of hunters in 3 counties, until he was called a thief and put out of his position with nothing, and died 2 winters later, owing a debt he never incurred. She heard herself say it, and was ashamed of the bitterness in it, and pressed her lips together, and returned her attention to the main. The Duke's eyes had sharpened on her in a way she did not see, because she was not looking at him, and did not know that the word thief had struck something loose in him too. A small, uneasy stone dislodged from a wall he had not thought to examine. "What was his name?" he asked. "Thomas Hartley," she said, "though I should not think Your Grace would have cause to remember it." He did not answer that he already half did, a name from an old estate ledger, from before his own father's death, attached to a scandal he had been too young and too newly grieving his brother to look into closely. He said only, "No," which was not quite a lie, and was troubled the whole of that day by the shape of the thing he had not said. That evening he had his valet bring up the old estate account books from the year of his father's death, and sat with them long past midnight, a single candle burning low, searching for a name he was almost certain he would not find recorded kindly. He found, instead, only a brief, cold entry, T. Hartley, dismissed, misappropriation of stud fees, with no figures beside it, no witness named, no appeal recorded, and the absence of detail troubled him more than any accusation could have. Because a man who kept careful books, as his father always had, did not usually leave a dismissal so thin, unless someone else had written the entry for him. They fell, without either of them naming it, into a kind of habit. She was not permitted near the stable, that remained, officially, forbidden, and so their meetings had the shape of accidents that stopped, after the 3rd or 4th time, being accidental. He would find some reason to walk the yard at the hour she came to feed the stallion the crust of bread she saved from her own meagre supper. She would find some reason to pass the paddock, when his morning ride, on some gentler mare, brought him back toward the house. They spoke of small things, of weather, of the price of hay, of a fox that had been troubling the hen coop, and beneath the small things, unspoken, a larger conversation ran, the way a river runs beneath ice, audible if a person stopped and listened. He began, twice, to say something more than the weather allowed, and stopped himself both times, once with his hand half lifted, as though he might have touched her sleeve, before he drew it back and folded it behind him instead. once with the words "I wonder if" actually formed and then swallowed, turned instead into a remark about the state of the north hedge. She noticed both. She said nothing of either, and told herself she had imagined the second. It was Corvus who broke the silence properly. In the end, though neither of them would ever quite agree on whether to credit the horse or the December storm that nearly killed him. The stallion took a chill in his chest that no one else could persuade him to let them treat. No groom could get near enough with a poultice to do more than singe him at the shoulder before he reared away. And on the second night of it, with sleet driving sideways across the yard and the beast's breath coming in a rattling wheeze audible clear across the cobbles, Wren left her narrow bed under the eaves, without leave, without a lamp, in her nightdress and a borrowed cloak, and let herself into the stable through the tack-room door she had long since learned unlatched easiest. She was still there, an hour past midnight, kneeling in the straw with the horse's great head heavy in her lap, a poultice bound at last to his chest, her hair come loose from its pins and her borrowed cloak soaked through, singing to him. Not a song, exactly, only a low, continuing thread of sound, the same wordless comfort her father had once poured into frightened animals, when the Duke, roused by a groom too frightened himself to go in, came through the door with a lantern, and stopped, and did not go forward, and stood a long while simply watching, because he had never in his life seen anything he wanted so much to be permitted to be part of. "You'll take your death," he said finally, low, so as not to startle the horse. "He'll take his, if I go," she answered, not looking up. "Which is the greater loss, do you think, your grace? A Duchess's stallion, or a housemaid's cough?" He came and knelt beside her in the straw, the Duke of Rivenhall, in his shirt-sleeves, in the cold, in the mud, and did not answer the question, because there was no answer he could give her that would not have told her something he had not yet found the courage to say even to himself. It was at some hour past 2, when the worst of the wheeze had eased and the horse's breathing had settled into something almost peaceful, that the housekeeper, coming to check a latch left banging in the wind, found them there, the Duke and the maid, asleep sitting upright against the stall wall, her head fallen against his shoulder, his hand unconsciously resting over hers where it still lay upon the horse's neck. By breakfast, the whole house knew. By dinner, so did half the county, because the housekeeper's niece was under cook to Lady Cordelia Ashe, and news of that particular flavour travels faster than any letter could carry it. Lady Cordelia received the news over her chocolate, with a smile that did not once falter, which was, those who knew her would have said, the most alarming thing about it. She was 25, dark-haired, exquisitely composed, a second cousin of the Duke's on his mother's side, and had been, since the mourning year ended, the woman everyone in 3 counties expected him to marry. Her family's fortune had thinned to something perilously close to nothing, a fact known to almost no one outside her own household, and to one man beyond it, her father's former steward, a sharp-eyed, soft-spoken man named Josiah Pratt, who had left the Ashe family's employ under circumstances no one discussed, and had, curiously, found a comfortable new position not 2 years later, managing the accounts of Rivenhall Park itself. It was to Pratt that Cordelia sent, within the hour, a note requesting his presence in her private sitting-room. And it was there, behind a closed door, that the two of them spoke for the better part of an hour in voices too low for the maid dusting the corridor to make out more than the occasional word. Hartley, once, sharply, and the girl. And cannot be permitted. What passed between Cordelia Ashe and Josiah Pratt was not, That first evening, anything so crude as a plot. It began, as such things generally do, as fear given a shape it could work with. Cordelia's fear was old and specific, that without this marriage, her family's name would end in genteel ruin within 2 years, her younger sisters unmarriageable, her mother's health already fragile, broken by the shame of it. Pratt's fear was older still, and considerably less genteel, that the accounts he had been quietly bleeding from the Rivenhall estate for the better part of 6 years, a shilling here, a falsified lease there, a repair that had never been made, would not survive close inspection by a duke who had, of late, begun asking questions he had never troubled to ask before, questions that had the particular shape of a man newly interested in every corner of his own house, because a certain housemaid had made him want to understand what he owned and what he had neglected. Neither of them said the word ruin aloud. Both of them understood it perfectly. "She is nothing," Cordelia said finally, turning her chocolate cup a slow half-turn upon its saucer, watching the liquid settle. "A servant. He will tire of the novelty within the month." "He has not tired of it yet," said Pratt, "and the horse business will be all over the county by Sunday." "Servants do talk, my lady, when the tale is good enough." "Then we must see," said Cordelia, setting down her cup with the faintest precise click of porcelain on porcelain, that the tale becomes considerably less good. The Duke came to Wren 3 days later, in the cold clarity of a January morning, with an expression she had not yet learned to read on him. Not the careful blankness he wore before the household, nor the softened watchfulness he wore in the stable yard, but something graver, more deliberate, a man who had spent a sleepless night arriving at a decision and had come to deliver it before he could talk himself out of it. "You understand what is being said of us," he began, without preamble, standing a careful 3 feet from her in the empty tack room, his hands clasped behind his back, as though he did not trust them otherwise. "I understand what is being said of me, Your Grace," she said. "I doubt very much the same words are used of you." It struck him. She watched it strike him, watched something flicker and settle behind his eyes, and he was quiet a moment before he answered. "No," he admitted. "They are not. That is precisely the injustice I intend to correct." He drew a breath. "I am asking you to marry me, Miss Hartley." She had imagined, in the 3 sleepless nights since the storm, 100 ways this conversation might go, and in not one of them had she pictured herself feeling, at the words, a small cold drop in her chest, as though a door she had not known was open had just been quietly shut. "Because of what was seen," she said. "Because I will not have your name dragged through the county for an act of mercy toward a suffering animal," he said. "Because whatever else is true, you will not be made to bear alone the consequence of my household's gossip." It was, she understood at once, an honest answer, and a wound at the same time. Because it was an answer built entirely from duty, honor, and guilt, and contained not one word of the thing she had, foolishly, hoped he might say. She had watched him almost reach for her sleeve. She had felt his hand, unthinking, cover hers in the straw. And now, offered the very thing half the county's daughters would have wept for, she found she wanted, more than the ring, more than the title, to hear him say that he wanted her, not owed her, not was obliged to protect her, but wanted her. And he had not said it, because she did not yet know, he did not yet trust himself to believe it was permitted. She said yes. What else was there for a woman with no name left to protect except the one she might yet be given? But she said it, with her chin lifted and her voice level, the same voice she had used the whole of her ruined life to keep the world from seeing exactly how much a thing cost her. And the Duke, watching her face, mistook her composure for indifference, and left the tack room believing he had done a kindness that had cost her nothing at all. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. They were married quietly, 3 weeks later, in the small stone chapel at Rivenhall, with frost still thick on the windows and no one present beyond the household and a handful of tenants. Because a hasty wedding, everyone agreed without saying so aloud, was best conducted without an audience to remark on its haste. Lady Cordelia sent, with exquisite correctness, a gift of white gloves and a note wishing the new Duchess every happiness, and smiled at the dinner table 3 nights later when she remarked, to no one in particular, how very fortunate it was that His Grace had such a generous nature, to rescue a girl from certain ruin and make a lady of her besides. The word rescue travelled, so did charity. So, within a fortnight, did a version of the Storm Night story in which the new Duchess had not saved a suffering animal, but had, rather, contrived, quite deliberately, quite calculatingly, to be discovered exactly where discovery would force a proposal from a lonely, grieving man too honourable to leave her compromised. No one could say precisely where this version began. It began, in fact, in Josiah Pratt's careful hand, in a letter written to resemble the housekeeper's script and left, with practised carelessness, where a certain undercook would be certain to find and repeat it. Wren felt the change first in small ways, a curtsy held a half-second too long, a conversation that stopped rather than paused when she entered a room, an invitation to a neighbouring house that arrived addressed, pointedly, to His Grace the Duke of Rivenhall, with no mention at all of his wife. She said nothing of it to Julian. She had spent a lifetime learning to carry weight without letting her shoulders show the strain, and old habits, she was discovering, did not dissolve simply because a ring now sat upon her finger. What she could not hide from herself, in the privacy of the vast cold bedchamber that had been his mother's and was now, nominally, hers, was the loneliness of a marriage built on obligation. Julian was unfailingly courteous. He asked after her comfort, saw that the fires in her rooms were kept generously fed, rode with her most mornings along the same paddock rail where they had first spoken. But he was careful with her, carefully distant, carefully correct, in the manner of a man guarding against wanting something he had convinced himself he had no right to want. And she, mistaking his carefulness for the truth of Cordelia's cruel word, began, by slow degrees, to believe that she had indeed become nothing more than an act of charity that a kind man now felt bound to maintain. Twice in those slow, echoing weeks, she came upon him standing at her sitting-room door with his hand half raised to knock, and both times he lowered it before she could open the door to him, and made some excuse about the household accounts, and left her listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor, wondering what word had died behind his teeth. Once, riding beside her along the paddock rail, his hand had drifted toward hers on the pommel, near enough that she felt the warmth of it before he seemed to catch himself and drew back, murmuring something about a loose stirrup that did not need mending. She began to keep a private count of these small, arrested moments, the way another woman might have counted slights, though she could not have said, if asked, whether she was tallying evidence of his indifference or evidence of a feeling he did not yet trust himself to name. She kept through it all one small habit from her old life, a tarnished brass whistle, no bigger than her thumb, hung on a worn leather cord beneath her bodice, which had been her father's, and his father's before him. Used since some forgotten generation to call home frightened, straying animals across open country. She had shown it to no one. She touched it, now in the long silences of that echoing house, the way another woman might have touched a locket, and told herself it was foolish to want a marriage to feel the way her father's hand had felt on a trembling horse's neck. Warm. Certain, entirely without calculation, and knew, even as she told herself so, that she wanted exactly that, and grieved daily for not having it. It was in the tack room, 3 months into the marriage, sorting through a chest of old harness records at Julian's own quiet request. He had begun, since the wedding, methodically reviewing every ledger on the estate, a labour that had nothing romantic in it, and everything to do with a discomfort he could not name, but had begun, dimly, to associate with his steward's too smooth explanations, that Wren found, tucked behind a false bottom warped loose by damp, a bundle of letters 11 years old, tied with waxed twine, in a hand she recognized before she had read a single word of it, because she had grown up watching that hand write out breeding records at the kitchen table by candlelight. Her father's hand. The letters were not a confession. They were the opposite of a confession. Careful, indignant, increasingly desperate correspondence to the old Duke, Julian's father. Protesting his innocence of a charge of theft that Thomas Hartley swore, in letter after letter, he had never committed, and begging only for the chance to examine the very account books that had condemned him, an examination he had been repeatedly, mysteriously denied. The final letter, dated a bare fortnight before Thomas Hartley's dismissal, named, plainly, unmistakably, the young steward who had, he wrote, altered the stud fees in the ledger to conceal his own private borrowing, and laid the fault at my door, knowing I kept no copy of my own to prove otherwise. The steward's name, in her father's furious, grieving hand, was Josiah Pratt. Wren sat a long while on the cold floor of the tack room, with the letters in her lap and her mother's, her father's, whistle pressed hard against her palm, and felt something inside her that had been quietly bleeding for 11 years begin, very carefully, to close. She did not run to Julian at once. She had learned too well the cost of trusting too quickly in this house, and some cautious, hard-won instinct told her that a woman already whispered to be a schemer would do well to have more than a torn letter before she accused her own husband's trusted steward of theft. So she copied, in her own careful hand, the substance of what she had found, and hid the original letters where even a determined search would not easily discover them, and began, in the small hours when the house slept, to compare what she remembered of her father's old accounts against the figures now entered, year upon year, in Pratt's smooth, confident script, and found, before a fortnight had passed, 3 separate leases paid twice over. One to a tenant who had, records showed, died the year before the second payment was recorded. In the days after her discovery in the tack room, the small cruelties that had crept through the house all winter sharpened into something more deliberate. A footman, coached, she suspected, by nobody she could name, began addressing her correctly as Your Grace, while somehow contriving, through tone alone, to make the title sound like an accusation. An invitation to a neighbouring house arrived, as before, for the Duke alone, and this time a second note followed within the hour, addressed to Wren directly in an unfamiliar hand, warning her, with false solicitude, that a woman who has risen so quickly might do well to remember how quickly such things can also fall. She burned it in the sitting-room grate without showing Julian, telling herself she would not give Cordelia the satisfaction of a scene, and told herself too, though less honestly, that some small, tired part of her still feared he might agree with the sentiment. It was that same week that she began, in earnest, to weigh leaving. Not in anger, she was too practiced in swallowing anger to indulge it now, but in the quiet, methodical way she had once packed her father's few belongings after his death, folding grief into something small enough to carry. She told herself Julian would be better served by a wife society did not whisper about, that her presence cost him more in standing than her love could ever repay him in comfort. And one grey afternoon she went so far as to lay her canvas bag, the same one she had arrived with, open upon her bed, and stood looking at it a long while, with her hand pressed to the whistle at her throat, before Julian's voice in the corridor, asking after her, sent her sweeping the bag back into its chest, unwilling, even then, to let him see how close she had come to a decision she was not at all certain would have made either of them happier. It was Cordelia who forced the reckoning, in the end, though she believed to the very last that she was forcing something else entirely. The occasion was the county's spring assembly, the first grand entertainment the new Duchess had been obliged to attend, held in the long, candlelit ballroom of the Ashe family's own house, a deliberate choice on Cordelia's part, for a battle is always easier fought upon ground one knows. Wren wore blue, the only good gown she owned that had not been mended past, disguising, and stood near the wall with her chin lifted in the old familiar way, while beside her Julian, stiff with the particular discomfort of a man who had never learned to enjoy society, and now found himself watching every corner of a room for danger to his wife. Maid conversation he did not hear a word of. Cordelia waited until the dancing had paused, until enough of the room had gathered near enough to hear, before she crossed the floor with her smile perfectly composed and her voice pitched, with practiced skill, just loud enough to carry. "Your Grace," she said, dropping the smallest, most correct curtsy to Wren, "how very becoming you look tonight. Quite the transformation from a scullery girl. One can hardly credit how far a well-timed accident can carry a person. In this world." A ripple of laughter, uneasy, half-suppressed, moved through the nearest guests. "Though I confess I have always wondered, did you plan the storm as carefully as the rest of it, or was that at least a genuine stroke of fortune?" The room went very still. Wren felt, distinctly, the old cold drop return to her chest, the same one she had felt the morning Julian proposed, the confirmation of every fear Cordelia's smiling cruelty had spent months planting. She felt, too, the whistle at her throat, warm from her own skin, and thought of her father's hands, and did not, this time, let her chin drop. "I planned nothing, my lady," she said, clear and level, "except to keep a dying animal alive through a bad night. If your ladyship finds mercy so calculating a vice, I confess I am glad to have committed it." It might, even then, have ended there, a small skirmish rather than a battle, had Cordelia been content to let the room's murmured approval of that answer stand. She was not. Fear, the old fear, the ledger fear, the family's ruin fear, pressed her one step further than sense allowed. "Mercy," she said, with a small, brittle laugh, or ambition dressed prettily enough to pass for it. "I wonder, your Grace," this to Julian now, directly, her composure beginning, very slightly, to fray at its edges, whether you have troubled to ask your bride why her own father was dismissed from this very estate. Thievery does, I am told, sometimes run in a family's blood, however sweetly the daughter sings to horses. It was, everyone in that room would later agree, the exact wrong thing to have said, and precisely because it was aimed at the one subject upon which Wren Hartley, Wren Ashworth, Duchess of Rivenhall, could no longer be made to feel small. My father, Wren said, and her voice did not shake, though her hand at her side had closed hard around the whistle beneath her bodice, was called a thief by a man who altered the very ledgers used to convict him. I have his letters proving it, written in his own hand 11 years ago, naming the man responsible. And I have. She went on, turning now to Julian, whose face had gone very still, very focused. In the particular way she had learned, meant he was no longer merely listening, but calculating, weighing, deciding. 3 leases from your own estate books. Your grace. Paid twice to tenants who could not have received the second payment, because they were already in their graves. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before. No longer the hush of gossip anticipating cruelty, but the hush of a room realizing, all at once, that it had wandered into the middle of something far larger than a lady's spite. Julian did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. It was one of the things she had come, slowly, to understand about him, that his authority lived in stillness rather than volume. He turned first to Wren and said, in a voice that carried the length of the ballroom without effort, "You kept silent about this. I was waiting for proof enough that no one could call it invention," she said. "I did not wish to bring you a suspicion. I wished to bring you a certainty." Something moved across his face then that she had not seen there before. Not merely surprise, but a kind of dawning, painful respect, as though he were seeing, for the first time in its full shape, the precise nature of the woman he had married out of duty, and had somehow never permitted himself to properly know. "That," he said quietly, "is the same patience with which you gentled a horse 3 grown men could not approach. You have been managing my household's truth the same way you managed his fear, quietly, and without asking to be thanked for it." He turned then to Cordelia, and his voice, still measured, took on an edge that made the nearest guests draw back half a step. "You will forgive me, cousin, if I decline to accept an accusation of theft from a woman whose own steward, your family's former steward, I recall now, dismissed under circumstances no one troubled to examine closely, has spent 6 years bleeding my estate of funds he then, I begin to suspect, found other uses for." He paused, and the pause had the deliberate weight of a man laying the final piece of a puzzle he had, in truth, been quietly assembling for weeks. Ever since a housemaid's chance remark about a father wrongly called a thief had lodged, unexamined, in the back of his mind, and had sent him, sleepless night after sleepless night, through 11 years of ledgers he had never before thought to question. I have this past fortnight had my solicitor examine every lease and every account Mr. Pratt has touched since his arrival at Rivenhall. The discrepancies my wife found in 3 nights of candlelight, my solicitor confirmed in 3 weeks with the full resources of the law. I did not yet know how to bring the matter to light without exposing her to precisely this kind of spectacle. I see now I need not have worried. She has done it a good deal more elegantly than I could have managed myself. Cordelia's composure, for one unguarded instant, broke entirely, not into fury, but into something rawer and more frightened. A flash of the true terror beneath the performance. The ruin she had spent a year trying desperately to outrun, laid bare for anyone watching to see. It was there, and gone in a breath, replaced almost at once by a stiff, brittle dignity. But Wren, watching, felt for the first time not triumph, but something closer to pity, and understood, with the same instinct that had once read fear in a horse's flattened ears, exactly what had driven a proud woman to cruelty. Not, wickedness, but the same terror of ruin that had once driven her own father to write increasingly desperate letters no one troubled to answer. "You might have come to me," Julian said to Cordelia, more gently now, though no less firmly. "Whatever your family's difficulties, cousin, you are still my mother's kin. I would have helped you, had you asked honestly, rather than watched you try to purchase your rescue with my wife's reputation." Cordelia said nothing. Her chin, when she lifted it, trembled very slightly, and then steadied, and she withdrew from the room without another word. And it would be some months yet, not that night, not that week, before she would find, in the quiet ruin of her own exposed alliance with Pratt, the harder honesty to write Wren a private letter of apology that named, at last, the fear she had never once allowed herself to speak aloud in public. The room, in the long moment after Julian finished speaking, did what rooms of that kind generally do once the true shape of a scandal has been laid bare in public. It turned. Almost as one body, away from the woman who had orchestrated the evening and toward the woman she had meant to destroy, and the murmur that moved through the guests now carried an entirely different weight than it had carried an hour before. An elderly countess who had, until that moment, been among the coldest of Wren's critics, crossed the floor unbidden to press her hand and murmur something about courage and a father wronged. And Wren, accepting it, understood that whatever else the evening had cost, it had also, finally, given her back the one thing 11 years of quiet endurance had never quite managed to secure: a place in the room that no one could whisper away. Josiah Pratt was gone from Rivenhall within the week. His accounts seized, a warrant sworn out for the recovery of what could be recovered. And it was in the course of that final accounting that a magistrate's clerk, cross-referencing 11-year-old estate records at Julian's own insistence, found written confirmation. In Pratt's own hand from years before, a boastful private note never meant to survive him, of exactly the fraud Thomas Hartley had died protesting. The old Duke's ledger was formally corrected. Thomas Hartley's name, entered 11 years ago under the word "dismissed for theft," was struck through and rewritten in the careful hand of the present Duke himself, as wrongfully accused, innocence established, posthumously this spring. Wren read the entry standing in the estate office, with Julian's hand resting, unasked, at the small of her back, and found that the tears she had spent 11 years refusing to let anyone see her shed, at her father's dismissal, at his graveside, at every cold assembly where she had stood alone and unwanted, arrived at last, without warning, without the old grim effort of holding them back, and she did not try to stop them, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were not tears of grief. The Stallion had one further test to pass before the story could properly close, though neither of them thought of it, at the time, as a test. It happened 3 days after the assembly, when a careless, stable boy, new to his post and unfamiliar with the old rule, left the yard gate swinging in a sudden wind, and Corvus, spooked by the bang of it, bolted from the paddock into the open drive just as a farm cart came round the bend, its driver hauling too late on the reins. There was a moment, brief, terrible, where it seemed the black horse would go straight through the cart's traces, and Julian, nearest, threw himself forward with no thought at all beyond stopping it, and might have been trampled for his trouble, had Rain not come round the stable corner at that exact instant, with the brass whistle already at her lips, and blown once the low, carrying note her father had taught her as a girl for calling home a horse too frightened to hear a human voice. Corvus, checked mid-stride. His great head swung toward the sound the way it had swung, months before, in the stable yard, toward a voice he half remembered, and he came to a trembling, snorting halt not 6 feet from the cart's startled team, his sides heaving, his eyes finding her across the drive with the particular, unmistakable recognition of a creature who has at last been given something worth staying calm for. Julian, breathing hard, unhurt, crossed the drive to where she stood, with her hand still pressed to the whistle at her throat, and did not, this time, hold anything back, and did not choose careful words of duty or obligation. "I have been a coward," he said low, "only for her. I told myself I married you to save your name, because it was easier to believe that than to admit what I knew the night I found you asleep against my shoulder in the straw, that I had already begun to love you, and was afraid that if I said so, I would be asking you to want a man who let his own brother die under that very horse's hooves, and never forgave himself for it." He drew a breath that shook, very slightly, on its way out. "I am asking you now, not out of duty, not to save your name, which needs no saving, and never did. I am asking because I have watched you gentle everything in this house that I was too broken to touch myself, and I find I cannot imagine another single morning of my life that does not begin with your voice." Wren looked at him a long moment, the whistle warm in her palm, the horse's breath still clouding the cold air beside them, and thought of every silent, dignified night she had spent believing herself a charity kindly extended and never truly wanted, and let herself, finally, believe otherwise. "Then you had better stop asking," she said, "and simply say it." "I love you," he said. "I have loved you, I think, since a horse 3 men couldn't approach, put his head down for a girl with an empty hand, and nothing at all to gain by kindness. I am sorry it has taken me this long to say it plainly." "You said it in the straw," she told him, "with your hand over mine. I have simply been waiting, ever since, for your voice to catch up to what your hand already knew." Autumn came round again to Rivenhall, gentler than the frost that had first brought her there, gold in the beech avenue, and warm still in the low afternoon light across the paddock. And the walled kitchen garden, neglected, weed-choked, the year Wren arrived, stood now, trim and full, its late roses trained along a repaired south wall. Because a duchess who had spent her girlhood coaxing life from difficult ground had found, in restoring it, a kind of quiet joy that asked nothing of her but patience, and returned, each season, more than she had put in. In the stable yard, in the mellow gold of early evening, Corvus stood saddled and calm at the mounting block, ridden now, gently, only ever by the Duchess herself, and, of late, by the Duke beside her, the 2 horses matched at an easy walk along the paddock rail, where a servant girl and a grieving man had once spoken carefully of hay prices, while a much larger conversation ran unspoken beneath the words. A small brass whistle, worn smooth now with handling, hung from a nail just inside the tackroom door, within easy reach, no longer hidden beneath a bodice, but kept openly, proudly, in the place where every groom on the estate had learned to look for it first, should the black stallion ever again need calling home. There was, that autumn, a cradle being finished in the estate carpenter's shop, its headboard carved, at the Duke's particular instruction. With a small running horse, Wren stood at the paddock rail in the last warm light, one hand resting where, in a few months' time, there would be a child to carry the whistle forward into whatever storms a life might bring it, and felt Julian's arm come round her, unhurried, entirely certain, the way it had not been certain on the cold morning he first proposed out of duty rather than desire. Corvus, grazing nearby, lifted his great black head at the small sound she made without thinking. Half breath, half word, the same wordless comfort her father had given her, and came, unbidden now, unafraid, simply to stand near her. The way a creature will always, in the end, come home to the hand that never once asked anything of it, but trust. There, she said softly, to the horse, to her husband, to the whole quiet, golden evening. I know. And so the house that had once kept its rooms shut and its fires low learned, at last, to burn warm the whole year through. And if you have ever doubted that the gentlest hand in a room can also be the strongest, Rivenhall Park, on any autumn evening, would have been glad to prove you wrong. Thank you for spending this time with Wren and Julian's story. If their journey moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next tale of quiet courage, finding its unlikely reward.